Imagine waking up believing you live in a stable society, only to learn that every assumption about its strength was an illusion, that its institutions were held together not by confidence, but by the thin thread of people pretending everything was fine. Now imagine discovering that this same illusion existed in 1776, and that it exists again in 2025. The mystery is not whether economic despair triggers political upheaval. The real mystery is why the pattern keeps repeating, even when history leaves us warnings in plain sight. Before we continue, I'd love to kindly ask you to give this video a like and subscribe if you find my content valuable. Your support truly brings this small channel to life, and it means the world to me. It helps me keep researching, crafting, and sharing the thoughtful economic stories I genuinely enjoy creating for you. Thank you for being here. It really makes a difference. For centuries, revolutions have been portrayed as political explosions, sparked by brave leaders and ideological manifestos. But the deeper truth, the uncomfortable truth, is that most revolutions don't begin with speeches. They begin with empty pockets, rising prices, and a population slowly realizing that the system no longer works for them. When people cannot afford the future they were promised, they begin to question the past they were taught. And when those two pressures collide, societies fracture. This is where our story begins, with the overlooked economic triggers behind history's biggest turning points, and the eerie resemblance between those triggers and what's happening right now. Before we get to modern parallels, we need to step back to a world on the edge of collapse. A world ruled by global empires, drowning in debt, struggling with inflation, and afraid of losing control. The 18th century Atlantic economy looked stable from the outside. It looked civilized. It looked permanent. But beneath that polished exterior was a system stretched to its breaking point. European powers had spent decades fighting expensive wars. Britain, France, and Spain burned through money faster than they could borrow it. Financial systems that were designed for small kingdoms were suddenly being used to fund global battles, overseas colonies, and ballooning bureaucracies. The numbers no longer added up, but governments pushed them aside, assuming greater growth or future tax revenues would save them. Then came the twist. Instead of adjusting, those governments squeezed the only group they believed they could still control: ordinary people. Taxes rose. Prices rose. Of course, wages didn't. And as everyday citizens struggled, those in power insisted the crisis was temporary, manageable, exaggerated. By the 1760s, Britain's national debt had skyrocketed to an unprecedented level. To pay for it, Parliament imposed new taxes on the American colonies, assuming they would simply comply. After all, the colonists were still subjects. They had no real political power, and no nation had ever successfully overthrown a global empire. But economics does something that political authority can't predict. It changes what people are willing to tolerate. And the colonists, squeezed by taxes, disrupted by trade controls, and increasingly excluded from the prosperity they were promised, reached a breaking point. This is the origin of our story: economic pressure creating political opportunity. The rise of anger in the colonies wasn't sudden. It built slowly, like steam trapped in a sealed machine. Each new tax added pressure. Each ignored petition tightened the bolts. Leaders like Samuel Adams, John Hancock, and Benjamin Franklin didn't invent the anger, they simply gave it direction. They understood that when people feel cheated by a system they once trusted, their loyalty evaporates. By the early 1770s, the British Empire believed rebellion was impossible. The colonists had no army, no navy, no consistent leadership. But what they did have was something much more dangerous: downward mobility. People who believed their lives would improve suddenly saw things getting worse. And when the future closes, revolt opens. The breaking point came when Parliament doubled down. Instead of easing the pressure, Britain responded to unrest with force, deploying soldiers to American cities, enforcing new trade barriers, and punishing dissent. The more the government tightened its grip, the more colonists interpreted the crisis not as temporary mismanagement, but as a structural failure of the entire imperial system. This is a pattern seen in almost every major revolution. The ruling class mistakes economic desperation for disobedience and cracks down instead of stepping back. They believe fear will restore order, but economic despair doesn't fear power. It survives it. Because once people have nothing left to lose, the threat of punishment becomes meaningless. By 1776, the fallout became inevitable. The revolution wasn't just political rebellion, it was economic refusal. Merchants could no longer operate profitably. Farmers couldn't afford imported goods. Workers found wages stagnant while the cost of living climbed. Families struggled with shortages created by trade disruptions. The entire framework of daily life became unsustainable. And when life becomes unsustainable, systems collapse. The American Revolution wasn't a sudden explosion. It was a slow economic implosion. But even after independence, the new United States struggled with its own crises. Hyperinflation under the Continental Congress, state debts spiraling out of control, farmers rebelling during Shays' Rebellion, merchants demanding a stronger central government to stabilize the currency. The revolution solved one problem while creating a dozen new ones. Why? Because changing who governs does nothing unless the underlying economic structure is repaired. Which brings us to the modern world. After the financial crisis of 2008, governments passed policies sold as fixes. They injected money into the system to prevent collapse. They lowered interest rates to near zero. They encouraged borrowing. And for a while, it all looked stable again. Markets recovered. Banks survived. The system continued. But those fixes came with hidden consequences. Asset prices skyrocketed. Wealth inequality accelerated. Middle-class wages stagnated. Young people found themselves unable to buy homes, start families, or keep up with inflation. The cost of living rose faster than the economy itself. And just like in the colonies before 1776, governments insisted the problems were temporary. By the time we entered the 2020s, the pressure was already building. Housing costs hit record highs. Healthcare and education costs outpaced inflation. Debt became the foundation of economic survival rather than a tool for growth. And then, in 2020, the system was tested again. Governments printed money at historic levels to stabilize economies during the pandemic. For a short moment, it worked, but the long-term effect was predictable. Inflation surged, supply chains fractured, and public trust in institutions weakened. The same governments that promised stability delivered volatility. The same leaders who insisted everything was under control repeatedly changed strategies. And the public began to feel the same thing the colonists felt in the 1770s. The system no longer serves them. Here is where the parallels turn from interesting to alarming. In the 18th century, economic decline preceded political upheaval. In the 21st century, the data reveals a similar pattern. According to recent reports, more than half of adults in major Western economies say they feel financially worse off than their parents. Youth homeownership has dropped to historic lows. Real wages have stagnated for over 2 decades. At the same time, corporate profits and asset values have reached record highs. This is not a coincidence. It is the same divergence seen before major historical shifts. When elites accumulate wealth faster than the system expands, the gap becomes unsustainable. People begin to question the fairness of the system. They distrust institutions. They believe the rules are rigged, and once that belief settles in, no amount of political messaging can reverse it. We also see rising polarization, declining trust in elections, debates over central bank policies, and escalating public debt, all conditions present in the decades leading up to 1776. And just like then, governments respond with short-term fixes instead of structural reform. History shows that these temporary fixes rarely work. Britain tried them before the American Revolution. France tried them before 1789. Russia tried them before 1917. Even modern nations have attempted them before massive political shifts. The problem is that none of these fixes addressed the root cause, economic despair. They treated symptoms, not structures. So what does this mean for 2025? It doesn't mean that a revolution is guaranteed, but it does mean that the forces which historically produced revolutions are present again. High inequality, collapsing trust, rising living costs, public debt crises, and a political class that insists everything is fine. The real question is whether societies today will repeat the mistakes of the past or recognize the patterns in time to break them. As we close this story, there are 3 key takeaways. First, economic decline almost always precedes political upheaval, no matter the era. Revolutions are rarely ideological at the start. They are financial. Second, Institutions collapse slowly, then suddenly. Pressure builds quietly until it breaks loudly. By the time the public sees the cracks, the foundation has already shifted. Third, ignoring economic distress is far more expensive than addressing it. Empires that postpone reform lose power. Governments that avoid hard decisions create harder consequences. The warning is simple. History does not repeat perfectly, but it rhymes loudly enough for anyone willing to listen. If 2025 feels unstable, it is because the system underneath is under strain, just like it was in 1776. And societies that fail to learn from their financial past often find themselves living through their political future. If you want to understand how these patterns evolve, how economic systems reach breaking points, and what can be done to avoid repeating history's darkest chapters, join the discussion in the comments and subscribe for more deep dives into the forces shaping our world. The mystery is not whether revolutions start with economic despair. The mystery is why we keep ignoring it until it's too late.